So I'm going to just explain what we're about to do. We're basically doing a kind of a virtual tour where we're going to different places where the Kinot happen. So I have my Kinot book, and I've chosen 6 different Kinot. I've chosen 6 different Kinot, which I'm going to focus on. And I'm going to focus on them through the lens of where did the story happen, or things that we can learn from the location or the archaeology, etc. Also to make it known what's available, what you can see, where you can visit. And I'm going to end with a little bit of a heavier focus on archaeology as opposed to location, with a story of the place where we read Eikha last night. I'll tell you the story when we get there. Okay, so let me just set this up. Okay. So the internet here could be a little bit slow, so do allow some loading time. Our first kina, you should be able to see the screen loading. Our first kina is Vayikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu, called Eikha Eli, by the famous Elazar haKalir, 5th, 6th century Israeli poet, and we don't really know too much about him, but most of the kinot that we read are from him. Now, this particular kina, I'm not going to post the text. I'm just going to refer to it. I'm not going into analyzing every line of it. But the basic gist of Eikha Eli, Vayikonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu, is about the death of King Yoshiyahu, who died at the hands of Pharaoh Necho in what's known as the Battle of Carchemish. And I'd like to explain what that battle is, and then get into why I chose this as the first kina, and also why this is such an essential kina. So I'm going to take us to the place where it all happens. Let's go to Israel. Okay. So I'm going to explain what all these lines are in just a moment, but the story is the very last, like 25 years before the destruction of Beit Rishon, 25 years before the destruction of the first temple, we have a king known as Yoshiyahu. Now, Yoshiyahu is living in basically a power vacuum between the 2 great superpowers of the ancient Near East. Egypt to the south, you see I've highlighted Memphis as the capital of Egypt, and we have Assyria to the north. I have on the top right here, and Nineveh on the Tigris River. So those 2 forces basically are waning during this period of time, and that gives the kingdom of Yehudah the opportunity to breathe and shake off the yoke of these kingdoms, these empires, which have forced them into all sorts of treaties, agreements, as well as paying heavy taxes and getting into all these geopolitical situations which were not beneficial for the kingdom. During this time where we have this vacuum between Egypt from the south and Assyria from the north, Israel is, well, the kingdom of Judah is able to rebuild itself and strive towards getting to its former glory, though not quite, but on a spiritual level, yes. And the story of Yoshiyahu, which is mentioned in Melachim Bet in the Perek Chaf Bet, is a king who at 8 years old, after his father and grandfather worked very hard to eradicate any trace of Torah study and avodah, proper service in the Beit HaMikdash, he went back to that. And there was a story where he's about 8 years old, and there's a scroll that's discovered that was hidden away from his father and grandfather, that was hidden away in the temple. And it was opened exactly to the Parshiot of Tochacha, to those portions of Devarim in Kitavo, which tell us of all the bad things that will happen if we abandon the Torah. So this touches him. He's really, really moved, and because he has this geopolitical situation that enables him to do things more independently, and not be paying so many taxes to foreign countries, he ends up being able to do great things and to restore Torah study and to restore the temple service and to do a lot of great things. I'm going to refer to that a little bit later. But now let's talk about the actual battle. So the battle goes like this. Nineveh, which is the capital of the Assyrian Empire at the time, we're talking about, we'll get to the Assyrian Empire a little bit later in the second kina, But the Assyrian Empire is under attack. It is under attack by a coalition of the Medes, like Parasu Madai, the Medes near Persia, and the Babylonians. The Babylonian king at the time is Nebuchadnezzar, whose son Nebuchadnezzar is the crown prince, and he is leading the anti-Assyrian campaign, destroying the Assyrian Empire in the year 612 BCE. So we're talking about 2,630 years ago. Now, when the Assyrian Empire is destroyed, the city of Nineveh falls first, and this is after a series of them losing their grip, of course. I'm keeping the story pretty simple, but the Assyrian Empire's capital is burned. We even have the remnants of the burning. You can see them in the Boston Museum. You can see them in the Bible Lands Museum. In Iraq itself, in the palace, they found glazed bricks which turned into glass because of the heat of the burning of the palace. So the Babylonians destroyed the palace. You may be familiar with the story of the Battle of Lachish, which is glorified in Sennacherib's throne room from Nineveh, which is in the British Museum. They chiseled off his face to erase his memory. That happened in the fall of Nineveh. Now, 7 years later, we don't even know who the Assyrian king is, like Ashurbanipal III. Is he around? Is he alive? Is he not? It's all mayhem. It's chaos. And the Assyrian Empire reaches out to their former enemy, Egypt, under Pharaoh Necho, known as the Sei's dynasty, the 26th dynasty. And Pharaoh Necho comes to assist his former enemy, because the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So this is the battle that we are talking about. So let's zoom out a little bit. So we have Egypt making their campaign. That's the red line, making their way to the city, which is on the Orontos. It's a city called Carchemish. And we'll see that in the Psukim in a moment. And he comes to meet the king of Assyria, or Assyria, as they are basically running away from the Babylonians. And this is their last front. This is in 605 BCE, known as the Battle of Carchemish in Turkey. And the Battle of Carchemish is where the Assyrians were handed a total obliteration, total destruction. The Assyrians are no more. The Assyrian Empire is gone. Now, how does that have to do with the king of Yehudah? It all has to do with the situation we were reading about. We were talking about a king who was under the impression that the level of righteousness of the people, this is how Chazal understand it, gives him the backing to stop any sword from passing through the land, which is one of the blessings. I think it's in Bechukotai, v'cherev lo ta'avor be'artzachem. When you follow the Torah and the mitzvot, a sword, even in times of peace, shall not pass through your land. And considering that the strategic location of Israel, which is on the bridge, on the land bridge between 3 continents, is always going to be a land that people are passing through, this is a tremendous blessing. The problem was that he was unaware of what was really going on, because he was very innocent. And you can say, in a sense, he was so good, he was a little bit naive, and he wasn't aware that there was a lot of idolaters who are hiding their idolatry. So he wasn't standing where he thought the country was standing. And that's why the Navi Yirmiyahu tells him, don't get involved in this foreign affair. Now, what he ends up doing, he does not listen to the Navi Yirmiyahu, and he marches up to the city of Megiddo, which is the source of the name Armageddon, Armageddon location. That's why it's called that. It has to do with the New Testament. I'm not getting into that. It's not important for here, but Armageddon means the Battle of Megiddo. And Megiddo is what's important for our story. We're going to go to Megiddo in a moment, but what's important for us to see is that Megiddo is overlooking the main highway, which is called the Via Maris, which is Derech Hayam. It's the main way you would go close to the ocean, going from north to south. And this is the natural way that you would have traveled if you're going up to Turkey and Assyria. Now, Yoshiyahu has the impression that he could block Pharaoh Necho. And if you know the ancient geography and topography, the most logical place to block him is in the narrow passes of Megiddo, where you have all of the advantage of being on the top of the hill, but you can you can basically capture everybody who is passing through. And this is why he had the impression that he would be able to actually stop Pharaoh Necho. And that takes us to Tel Megiddo. So first of all, we see where it is. Okay, Tel Megiddo has a very commanding view in all directions. And I'd like to zoom in so we can get a bit of an aerial view of what Megiddo looks like. Now, the current excavations, the season which just ended, I think last week or 2 weeks ago in Tel Megiddo by Tel Aviv University, is a very, very important excavation. And that's because of the stratigraphy of close to 30, maybe 31 different layers of civilizations going a few thousand years back, which have been carbon dated to a very high level of exactitude. I'm looking for a better word, but very, very exact, very precise. That's the word I'm looking for. And the most recent discoveries are going to be published very soon, probably in November in the Acer convention. But basically, every single accuracy, thank you, David, every single ancient Near Eastern archaeologist who is trying to give a very precise and accurate date to what they're digging, and they have some confusion, is going to have to bend to what the site of Megiddo has discovered. They are the ones who decide. So the Megiddo is it's a very important site. Follow them. There's a lot of things about their publication going on now on YouTube as well. But this is the site that we're looking at, Megiddo. So if we want to see where Yoshiyahu was killed, he was killed here in Bik'at Megiddo, where he was able to have the vantage point of the Tel below us, the archaeological Tel, which is able to control this passage, but he got killed. Now, I'd like to focus on the story itself. So first of all, we have the verses from the Kinot. So the Kinot, in some of the Siddurim, it's Kinot number 11, but it goes, Vayekonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Yirmiyahu, the prophet Jeremiah, laments Yoshiyahu. This is the first time that we have a Kinot over a fallen king. We have the Kinot over Shaul and Yonatan as well, but let's just, for the purpose, this is the first Kinot that's instituted. And it goes on, Eikha Eli konenu me'elav. How is this possible? We lament. Ben shmoneh shana echel lidrosh me'elav. He started beseeching God at the age of 8. And Bnei Cham be'ovram, as the children of Cham, meaning the Egyptians, chanu alav, when they camped upon him, velo uzkar lo sigui mif'alav. All the greatness of what his deeds did not help him at that moment. So there's a few lines here, but there's a few lines here which I want to mention, which is at the end. Sorry, the second line first. Gam b'chol hamelachim kamu ligdor, lo kam kamo mimot avigdor. All of the previous kings who tried to institute things to protect the Torah, to protect learning, to protect avodah, and to go against avodah zarah, nobody came close to what he did, which was nothing like anything anyone did from the days of Avigdor. Who's Avigdor mentioned in Divrei Hayamim is understood to be Moshe Rabbeinu. Davak bo avon leitzanei hador, but the cynics, the people who were fooling around behind his back, basically were the cause of his demise. Asher achar hadelet kamu lizdor. They set up their idolatry, their avodah zarah behind their door. It's a very, very famous story. So, and it goes on where it talks about how he was perforated. He was shot by so many arrows, 300 arrows. And as he's dying, Yirmiyahu is there hearing his dying words. And he says, Ruach sfatav iftzah mipihu. He hears his dying breath saying, Tzadiku Hashem, ki mariti pihu. God is just, and I have gone against his word. Now, Tzadiku Hashem ki pihu mariti is the verse said in Eikha. And our tradition is, our Masoret is that the 4th chapter of Eikha, Eikha yu am zahav, yishneh haketer atov, how could the pure gold possibly be dimmed, is a reference to this person who is pure gold. And therefore it continues, Safdulo Eikha be-22 otiyot. The Eikha lamentation with 22 letters was in his name, referring to that particular part. And so every single word, the first word in every stanza here, is from the 4th chapter of Eikha. Now I'm going to read to you one part here from Divrei Hayamim, which says as follows. Hang on. We have the story of Yoshiyahu. On the 18th year of Yoshiyahu, there was this incredible Pesach that he did. And then it says, Acharei kol zot asher echinu Yoshiyahu et habayit, he prepared the Beit HaMikdash for this Pesach. Ala Necho melech Mitzrayim, lehilachem bekarkemish al Prat. So Necho, this Necho, Pharaoh Necho, the king, the second Necho, the king of Egypt, is going to battle on Karkemish on the Euphrates. Vayetze likrato Yoshiyahu, he comes to block him. Vayishlach elav malachim. So the Pharaoh is like, what do you want from me? I have no quarrel with you. Mali valach melech Yehuda. Lo alecha ata hayom ki el bet milchamti ve'Elohim amar levaneni. Like I'm in a rush here. Get out of the way. Chadal lecha me'Elohim asher imi ve'al eshchitecha. Like God's with me. Don't let me destroy you. I have no interest with you. Yoshiyahu refuses to listen to him. He refuses to listen to Yirmiyahu, and he ends up fighting. Velo shamal divrei Necho mipi Elohim vayavo leilachem bevik'at Megiddo. He fights in the valley of Megiddo. Vayoru hayorim lamelech Yoshiyahu. He's shot. He's dying. Vayomer hamelech la'avodav haviruni ki ochlet timon. Take me away. I'm dying. Now they're basically taking him and they bury him in Jerusalem as Pharaoh Necho continues up north to be involved in the battle, where he ends up losing, coming back and taking control of the region until the Babylonians take control. But I want to focus specifically on Pasuk Chaf Hei. We're in Divrei Hayamim Bet Lamed Hei Chaf Hei, which is this: Vayekonen Yirmiyahu al Yoshiyahu. Yirmiyahu, the prophet, laments Yoshiyahu. Vayamru kol ha-Sharim ve'ha-Sharot. Anybody who sings in their kinotehem al Yoshiyahu ad hayom, vayitnum lechok al Yisrael ve'inam ktuvim al sefer ha-Kinot. Basically, the very idea of Kinot being something that we do comes from this very story because of the impact that it had. I'd like us to consider, why is it that Yoshiyahu's failure is something that we lament about as the Kina par excellence? Lokam kamo mimot avigdor. When we think of anything that we could possibly do today to try to strengthen the connection to Torah and mitzvot, nothing comes close. Nothing comes close to what Yoshiyahu did. And if he failed, what could we possibly hope to achieve? It is so devastating that he had the resources of the kingdom and he did everything and he was so good and he was pure gold and he just was destroyed. And you think, what chance do we possibly have if he failed? So it's such a cataclysmic failure and destruction that we say, like, this is the standard for what we could hope for. If we can't do that, what hope do we possibly have to bring any kind of rebuilding or tikkun? That's why it's such an incredibly powerful story. Now, that's the first kina. The second kina is chronologically a little bit earlier, and that has to do with the destruction of Samaria. Shomron kol Titen. So Shomron kol Titen we read at night as well as during the day. So at night it's number 4. And it's basically referring to the destruction of Judea and Samaria, the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom of Israel in Shomron and the southern kingdom of Yehuda in Yerushalayim. And borrowing a metaphor from Yechezkel, when the prophet Yechezkel Hanavi refers to those two cities, those two kingdoms were destroyed. When he's in the exile in Babylon, he refers to them as two sisters. Ohalo, meaning his tent, and Ohaliba, my tent is in it. His tent, it refers to the Samaria because there were these tents for worshiping Avodah Zarah, for worshiping golden calves in Beit El and in Dan and so on, basically saying, God, that's someone else's tent, not God's tent. That one, Ohaliba, my tent is in Jerusalem. So it basically talks about the destruction of the 10 tribes. Now, I'd like to take us to the location itself, which is Samaria. So what exactly is Samaria? We say Judea and Samaria, right? We say every single day in the Amidah, in the Shmona Esrei, Uvdechinu Mecha Yehuda veYisrael, a reference to two kingdoms, which since they split after the son of Shlomo HaMelech, in his time when they became the northern kingdom, they haven't been together since. Now, the kingdom of Shomron was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire, roughly 140 years before the fall of the temple. And I'd like to take us to see the location itself, which today is close to Area A. So you can go in, but you need some army escort in different parts of it. It's not the safest place to go on your own, but there are organized tours to go there. And the city has been called Sebastia. The ancient ruins of Shomron are in Sebastia. Now, the site of Sebastia, this is the parking lot. It's very clearly a Hellenistic city, Greek and then Roman. And that's, of course, because that's the ones who gave it the name. So it was a Greek and Roman town. When we talk about the story of Hanukkah, we're talking about the Seleucid Syrian Greeks, not the Greeks that come from Greece. The Syrian Greeks' main base camp was in Samaria, and they went down into the hills of Modi'in, Gofna, etc., and that's where the stories of the Maccabees took place. So this is really the headquarters of the Seleucid Syrian Greeks. But I'd like to take us to earlier ruins, which are the ruins of Shomron from the time of the kings of Israel. This is identified as the palace of Achav. So Achav, the son of Omri, the Omridic dynasty, it's Omri who moved the capital to Shomron. It was previously in Machanaim, in Tirzah. It moved around a little bit. This is where the kingdom of Israel established its kingdom, its capital, all the way until its destruction. In these ruins, there were several excavations here. In the ruins of this first temple period palace, we found the remnants of the burning of Samaria, known as the Samaria ivories. Now, our time is short, so I don't have the luxury to go into all the details in the museums and archaeology that I would have loved to do. But I'm going to show you one fragment of ivory from the Israel Museum, which shows you, first of all, ivories, which is a luxury statement in this period of time. Ivory comes either from elephant tusks, there's Asian elephants, or from hippopotami, the teeth of the hippopotamus. That's why the word for ivory in Hebrew is shen, simply tooth. So the ivories on the left are still clean and white, but the one on the right is burnt. And that's the burning identified as the burning of Samaria by the Assyrian kings, such as Tiglath-Pileser, Sargon, Shalmaneser, Sancheriv, etc. And you can Google Samaria ivories. There's plenty of pictures available online. There's a few in the Chicago Oriental Institute as well, I think. But these are famous. So these are typical Phoenician ivories, but they have to do with the architecture, which is described in Tanakh as the palaces of Achav, who built these ivory palaces, or the palaces of Shomron mentioned in Amos as well, and other places as luxurious, and the luxuriousness is expressed in having ivory. This is the ivory of the burning of the ivory. Now let's get to what happened in the aftermath of the destruction. Remember, we're talking about the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire, at the height of its power, controlled large parts of Egypt, Turkey as well, and all the way east, including Babylon. So at different parts, at different times, and they ended up waning, of course. What we see here is that it's a very large empire. The Assyrian deportation, meaning the deportation, the exiling of the 10 tribes, is what made the 10 tribes lost. Specifically, the Assyrians had a very cruel mode of deportation. So I'm showing you a map that sort of gives you an idea. Now, this map found in some of the Tanakhs basically shows you in the orange lines, it shows you that the Israelites from the 10 tribes are being sent out to different concentrations based on the psukim, Lachlach, Chavor, Nehar Gozan, V'harei Madai, Lachlach, V'chavor, etc. These are the lined orange areas, or areas where Israelites were deported to, and then mixed and shuffled up to make sure that they're sufficiently mixed up and cannot go back home. And this had a very profound impact on them, because most of the 10 tribes are lost because of the cruel Assyrian deportation method. What they did instead is these purple areas is they brought those other people from different areas, Kuta, Avas, Farvaim, and the Arabians brought them in to the places that were depopulated from Israelites and repopulated them with foreigners. This is part of their ingenious way of making sure people don't rebel, they don't run away, they can't maintain loyalty to a country because they are no longer in their country. And it's also cheap labor for the empire. Now, I was recently in a dig near Modi'in in a place called Tel Hadid, where they just found this summer, they found a seal made from mother of pearl. Mother of pearl at that time came only from the Persian Gulf. And the suggestion, which I heard, it hasn't been published yet, but the suggestion I heard is that this is an area that was repopulated by the Assyrians by people who came from that region, right? So they have some of their local belongings with them, things that are indigenous to the Persian Gulf, very far away from home. So we have the Samaritans, for example, who live in the area of Holon and Shechem, are people who came from these different areas and were repopulated and adopted the religion. And I mean, you may be familiar today, they celebrate Korban Pesach. They claim that they are the original kingdom of Israel, but that's the Shomronim, okay? So this is what the Kinah says. I'll read one line is Lo lach ohaliva chashov onich keoni. You, Jerusalem, don't even compare your depravity to mine. Hatamshili shivrech leshivri ulecholi. Could you compare what you suffered to what I suffered? Ani ohala. I have been wayward. I have done terrible things. I've been treacherous. It came, of course, to bite me. In a very short period of time, very rapidly, I paid my debts. The king of Assyria, took all of my fruit. He stole all of my treasures. Lachlach and Chavor, which are the two central orange areas that we see, they took all of my captive. So domi ohaliba ve'al tichri, don't cry like me. Shnotayich archu velo archu shanai. You have lasted for much longer than I have. And they all cry and they moan, I've been burned, I've been destroyed. So that's Shomron Kol Titen. So the first two Kinot basically are Kinot of the first temple period. Our third Kinah is a Kinah which has to do with the second temple period and the destruction that has to do with the Kohanim. Eikha Yashevah Havatzelet ha-Sharon. Eikha Yashevah Havatzelet ha-Sharon is referring to the 24 priestly shifts, which are attributed all the way back to the time of the first temple, as well as to Nehemiah. We have the division of the Kohanim into 24 families divided into two. So basically twice a year, you have a shift. So there's 12 months, 24. So basically twice a year, you're serving in the temple. So it's not everyone all at once. And I'd like to show you, there's a lot to discuss about this particular Kinah, but I want to talk about a few locations that have to do with it. So I'm going to start in the Old City, okay? In the Old City, there is a place called the Burnt House, Beit Katros. Now, Katros, you can see it here. I'm zooming up, zooming in. The Katros is known from the Talmud as one of the 24 priestly families. And this particular site, which we don't have the time to go into, but it's very, very famous, is a destruction layer where they not only found a weight, they actually found two weights across the street from each other that say Katros on them. That means that they were doing business with Katros. They were a wealthy family who were heavily criticized for, they were responsible for taxes, and they took advantage of that to enrich themselves on the backs of the people. So they were harshly criticized. But the Katros house is a wealthy house, a burnt house, which is there underneath the Quarter Cafe and Yeshivat HaKotel, that general area. And they found there an arm of a woman. I mean, archaeologists can tell what bone it is. It was from a woman whose arm was cut off basically by the Romans when they came to destroy it. Now, It's possible also that these are Jews fighting against Jews, which happened. But either way, we're talking about that final stage of Jerusalem before it was burnt. Actually, a Mizrahi TV, you can just Google Mizrahi TV. They have keynotes on location. It's a very long video, more than an hour, where they have excellent tour guides, including my father, who talk about different locations that have to do with the Kinot. And he actually goes in here, so you can look up Mizrahi TV on YouTube and see the Kinot on location. It just came out. It's the third to last video. So this is one place in the old city that is directly related to one of the priestly families. Now, the haKalir who wrote this Kinah, again, is using every single of the 24 stanzas about the 24 families as in a word from Eikha, of course. I mean, a lot of the Kinot do this, and it starts family by family. What their name is based on where they lived at the end of the Second Temple, not what they were called biblically, which was the first one would be Yehoyariv, the family associated with the Hashmonaim, but they're called Mesarvei Maron. The first stanza, Eikha Yashevah Havatzelet ha-Sharon v'damam ron mipi nosei Aaron, basically the singing, the happiness from those who carried the Aaron. In this case, that also may be the Leviim, but it's talking about the Kohanim. V'nau mishmerotam Kohanim b'nei Aaron. Many of the Kohanim who used to be joyous and carry the Aaron are now sitting in mourning and moving away, banished from their mishmeret. Kinimsar habayit b'mesarvei Maron, as the house was basically given over by the people from Maron, which is understood as this is the family that was in service during the time of the destruction, the family who ended up being exiled and living in the area of Meron, Mount Meron. So they're living all over the Galil, etc., and all over. Now, we can go on and on about the Kinah, but I want to show you another location in the old city, and that is the Kidron Valley, where we have several Second Temple period mausoleums, and one of them is called the tomb of Bnei Chazir, not Chazir the pig, but Chazir is a biblical name referring to one of the family heads of the 24 family Mishmerot shifts of the Kohanim. So it's right here. You see there's the burnt house, there's the Temple Mount, and here they are in the Kidron Valley. Let's jump into a street view. So we're in the Kidron Valley, right below the Dung Gate, which is how you'd go into the Kotel by car, by bus, and towards the Lion Gate. So we're basically in the southern part. And there's a few mausoleums here. There's what's known as Yad Avshalom, etc. But here on top, there was an inscription that was found which identified this burial as the burial of Bnei Chazir. So a priestly family. It's, of course, a VIP burial site, and they were buried here. Now, of course, these kind of burials were looted and plundered, so we don't really find anything in them anymore, but there's inscriptions. What I want to show you is something different. These are things that are more known, but I come from the museum education, archaeology. I want to share with you things that have to do more with museums, which are very surprising. In several different locations, not only in Israel, but also in Yemen, we found synagogue inscriptions which have fragments of lists of the Kohanim. So we have, you can look carefully here. This is a picture from Yosef Navez's excellent book, Al Psifas Va'Even, from 1987, a book which basically compiles all the Hebrew and Aramaic inscriptions from all the known synagogues in Israel and the world at the time. We know much more than that today. And he shows you on the left, here's a full reconstruction. So you can sort of hold the Kinot in your hand if you want, and then compare Mishmeret Rishona Yehoyariv, Mesarvei Marom. That's what I mentioned. Then there's Mishmeret Shniya is Mishmeret Yeda'aya. So there's the biblical name, Yeda'aya, but they come from Emok Tziporim, which is Tzipori in the Galil, right? And then it goes on and on. Charim is Mifshata, on and on. So we have their names here. We have Yeshevah, who come from Shichin, etc. We only have 3 fragments. This is from Caesarea, from a synagogue in Caesarea. There were also 2 more found in Israel, one in Kisufim and one in Ashkelon. They were recorded, I think the one in Ashkelon was recorded by Clermont Gannou, but unfortunately, since the time he recorded it and there were friezes of it made, it vanished. So luckily we have at least records of it, but it's been destroyed or vanished. We don't know where it is. And the fourth one, which is really cool, comes from Bet El Khacha, which is in Yemen, which of course also vanished. But before it vanished, there was it was discovered by a German archaeologist, and there was a frieze made by a Russian archaeologist. And because of the frieze, which you basically press a paper on it and trace with a pencil, we have the text. And that's all we have. But this is the most complete text of the 24 Mishmerot Kehunah ever found, much more than the one in Caesarea, like we saw. So, and this is Sha'arim Chitlu Mishmar Revi'i, etc. Beit Lechem Mishmar Chamishi. So it's not even from the beginning, not till the end. It goes from number 4 to the 14th Mishmeret with missing parts, but it's a lot more than we have, and it's all the way in Yemen. We think about, let's think about this. I mean, the 24 Mishmerot Kehunah, right? These are something which is detached from our life. We don't really think about that anymore. We think that, you go to the temple and there's lots of Kohanim all at once. We don't understand that there's sort of like a shift. There's 24 Mishmerot of Kohanim, of Levi'im. There's Ma'amadot of Israel, so that not everybody's there all the time. We take shifts, sort of like spread the load. But we have a concept of this connection to the 24, which is part of our synagogues. It's not something we think about anymore. What is it doing there? We don't know. There are those who suggest that there were Kohanim from those particular Mishmarot in those synagogues, even if we're talking about Yemen, who wanted to remember their connection as part of this heritage, and therefore they put it in the synagogue. But as we'll see towards the end, it's one of many things that Jews did after the destruction to maintain a connection to the temple in everyday things, including in synagogues, of course. Okay, so now I'm going to jump from here. We have 3 more Kinot to go and about 22 minutes. So we're probably going to have to skip a little bit. But Sha'ali Serufah Ba'Esh. Sha'ali Serufah Ba'Esh is the Maharam of Rottenburg. The Maharam of Rottenburg is a student of the famous Rabbi Eikha Eli of Paris, who was debating against the Nicolas Donin, who was a Jew who became a Christian, who basically slandered the Talmud as being anti-Christian, anti-Jesus, and there was public debates where, of course, you already know that it's a foregone conclusion no matter what happens on the argument. And he stood, Rabbi Eikha Eli of Paris, as well as Rav Moshe of Kuchi, amongst a few other scholars, stood to defend the Talmud, which was eventually burned. And I want to take us to the place where it was burned. So the burning of the Talmud, but I just want to mention, when we talk about the burning of the Talmud, we're talking about the year 1242. 1242 is a couple hundred years before the inventing of the printing press, the Gutenberg. So the Jewish printing press we're talking about in Sanshino later. So this is all manuscripts, hand copies, which were painstakingly written down. Sometimes it took him years to write them. This is the destruction of the learning, the ability of Jews to even learn without the Tanakh. What are you supposed to do without these books? There is nothing left. It's a tremendous travesty. And so the Kinot itself has to do with France, and I want to take us to where it took place. So we're going to Paris. Now, when we think of Paris, and we want to think about culture, we usually think about the museum, of course, the Louvre, right? The Louvre is considered to be the cultural center, one of the cultural centers of Europe. There is so much incredible knowledge there, the height of European painting and archaeology from around the world. When we compare that to the Kinot of Sha'ali Serufah Ba'Esh, while this is loading, I want to refer to some of the lines. So Sha'ali Serufah Ba'Esh lishlom avilayich, you who are burned by fire, why don't you inquire how the people mourning you are doing? Because apparently they're mourning you and you're gone. We're talking about the Talmud, which has been burnt, of course. We're talking about people in the Middle Ages, in the Dark Ages. They're walking in darkness. There is no light, and they're just hoping for the light of day. And I'm skipping some lines. How could it be you who were given through an eating fire. We're saying it's comes from the fire of God, which is like a spiritual fire, a consuming fire. Te'ukal be'esh basar, could you possibly be consumed by the fire made by flesh? V'lo nichvu zarim begachalaych, and these foreigners who burnt you, they were not burned from trying to destroy you? Like, how could that possibly be? The shock at this eternal wisdom which is being destroyed by barbarians. And it goes on and on. I'll go to Moshe and Aaron and Hora and ask, is there maybe a new Torah that's being given, that these scrolls have been burned? Now, the Kinot is written about a fire which took place not here in the Louvre, which we like to think of as the plaza of wisdom, of culture, but rather right nearby, in this location. Now, this is a hotel currently. But one second. Sorry. It's jumping a little bit. Okay. This palace is currently a hotel, but it used to be called Place de Grève, which has to do with gravel. It was on the shore of the Seine River. And this is basically where they did all the public executions. So this plaza, let it load. This is the plaza where the Talmud was burned. We're talking about 24 wagons stacked with volumes of the Talmud, and they were burned. Not only Talmud, also the Piskei Halacha of the Baalei Tosafot from France and so on. So many very valuable works, some of them are probably gone forever, were destroyed in this plaza. Now, if you actually visit this plaza, you're not going to actually see any commemoration of what took place there historically, but I want to take you to a place that does. There was a second place that, well, there were several areas and several locations over the next couple hundred years where they burned volumes of the Talmud. This is one of them, but the other one is also in 1553, during the Counter-Reformation in Italy. This is in Rome. So see, it's taking its time to load, but we'll do it. We're doing our best. So let's go to Italy, to where the second place was. Okay, it's loading a little bit slowly, but we are in Italy, and we are in a place which was a plaza in which was called the Campo di Fiori, where the Talmud as well was gathered. We're talking like several hundred years later, and burned in this particular plaza. I want to see if we can get a better view of it. Second. Okay. Here we are. Now, in the Campo di Fiori, in this plaza, there is a plaque that's actually there, and I want to enlarge the plaque so you can see it, because this place, it was very sensitive to this very Kinot. So as this loads, I'm going to click on this and look. Sha'ali Serufah Ba'Esh lishlom avenaich, and it says it in Italian. So this was put up in 2011, but this is a reference to the burning of the Talmud in September 9th, 1553, in this place. Ricordo del rogo del Talmud. So this is it. This is you can see it when you're actually there in Rome. Now, again, the magnitude of this destruction has to do with the fact that this was, this is already after the printing press, but before the printing press, and even then it wasn't all readily available to everyone. This is our knowledge. This is our lifeline. This is how we stay connected. And when this is severed, what do we possibly have, right? So it's something which we say Serufah Ba'Esh. It's a very, very tragic burning. And if you're ever in Paris, a few minutes away from the Louvre, you can actually read this Kinot in the place where the Talmud was burned. This brings us to our second to last Kinot. Our fifth Kinot has to do with the First Crusade. It's one of several Kinot. I just chose one of them at random because we can focus on any single one of them. But mi ten roshi maim. That's supposed to be roshi, not rosho. Somebody will make my head turn into water. Ve'ini mikor nozlai, and my eyes will be the source of my liquids. Basically, I will weep for the rest of my days and nights. All of the children and the babies who were murdered, and the elders who were killed, and on and on. This is a Kinot which is referring to the destruction of the three most important Torah centers in the Rhineland in the Middle Ages, known as Shum, Spira, Vermaisa, Magenza, Spire of Worms and Mines, and we're going to visit a few of them. I'm reading a line just about that. My eyes will flow with tears on the people who were killed in Spire. And then it goes on, Worms, which had tremendous Talmidei Chachamim. Rashi went to learn in Worms, which was then the center of Torah in the area. And it goes on, the community of minds. Also, you gave your lives on Kiddush Hashem. You're lighter than eagles and stronger than lions. So these are people who were murdered during the pogroms of the First Crusade. So let's go into that a little bit. The First Crusade, we're talking about when Israel was, while the Byzantine Empire is still around, Israel is under Seljuk and other Muslim territory. And at this point, we have Pope Urban II and so on. People are basically saying we have to liberate Jerusalem from the Muslims. And there's a lot of background to how he encouraged the various knights and landowners to get involved. But the point is, he gave them carte blanche. He basically said, all of your sins will be forgiven. And so you can basically do whatever you want because you're on the Holy Crusade. So the First Crusade from the summer of 1096 began in France, though the communities in France were mostly unharmed. It's the communities in the Rhineland on the border with Germany which were destroyed as the Crusaders made their way into the Holy Land. So let's take a look at these locations. So zoom out a little bit. Here we go. These three cities, you see, they're not that far from each other. We have Magenza on the left, and then further south, really, we have Vermaisa and we have Spira. Now, each one of these cities had different stories around them. In Spira, for example, about 10, 11 Jews were killed. The rest were saved by the local bishop who protected them, though it cost them heavily, but he saved their lives. But then the Crusaders came back and killed them. So we're talking about a small number at first and more later. But Vermaisa and Magenza, which is where Rashi studied, which were the centers of Torah, we have Rabbeinu Gershom or Hagolah and Magenza and so on. We're talking about, I think, 1,200 people killed during these periods. And many people, they were forced to convert by the sword or be killed, and the tortures are awful. Many stories are told about them. Many Kinot talk about them. So this happens here in the Rhineland. And basically, because of the destruction of the center of German or Ashkenaz, as it's called, Jewish centers of Torah study, France then rose to prominence in terms of its Baalei Tosafot, right? It became more prominent because Germany was destroyed. So this is the three different areas. I'd like to show you in some of them what you can actually see. So let's start with Vermaisa, with Worms, a community which was destroyed in the Holocaust. And recently there was a synagogue that was rebuilt there. Taking it a few moments. Okay, so here we are, Vermaisa. Typical, German city, but let's jump in and see the synagogue. There's also a museum here, but we're going to just look at the synagogue. Now, this is a synagogue which has been reconstructed after the Holocaust, but with remnants of the old synagogue. If you've ever been to, Europe, or you've been to like the old cemeteries, you'll recognize the style of the stones that are built into the wall. So this is part of the original building. And this modern art over here is actually a quote from Rashi. Ani lo bati ela lepshuto shel mikra, because Rashi learned in this neighborhood, not necessarily this actual building. There's also a Rashi mikveh here, which has nothing to do with Rashi. It's a mikveh in a shul where Rashi was in this neighborhood, so they call it the Rashi mikveh. But this is that's the shul. I'm going to jump in for a moment. And you can see the interior of the reconstructed shul. It's probably a very sad reconstruction compared to what it used to be. But you can see a little bit of the original Heichal. I think that's parts of it are the original Heichal. Looks much older. So this is in Vermaiza, and I'd like to take us now to Magenza, which has a much more impressive reconstructed synagogue, which actually won some sort of award, but it has an amazing story. Okay, now it's starting to show. You'll see that there's a very funky shape to the building, which is the shul. It's depixelating right here in the center, and it was actually a composition which includes the 5 words kedusha. The architect who made it made the word kedusha sort of. You see, there's a big kuf there in the middle, and it sort of continues. So that's on the outside. Again, this is kind of a modern art kind of thing, but I'm going to take you to the front and you'll see it up close. Let's jump in. Now, at the outside, of course, is a remnant of the ancient synagogue, which was destroyed in Kristallnacht and may have been hundreds of years old, but not sure it's the one from Rabbeinu Gershom. The Jews built and rebuilt there. But you see the funky shape on top. We're going to see the inside in just a moment. I'd like to focus on the door. I think I have a better picture of it over here. I just found a photograph on the internet. Okay. Now, look what it says on the door. On the door, there we go. Feels like the olden days when you waited 10 minutes for a picture to load. Okay. So it says, here, you can now see it, Ma'or HaGola, the light, the luminary of the exile, Beit Knesset Magenza. Beit HaKnesset Magenza. So we're talking about the synagogue where, the community where one of the rabbis or in the community which Rashi went to study by, Rabbeinu Gershom, and we know the famous Rabbeinu Gershom, Cherem de Rabbeinu Gershom against polygamy, right? Like that's him. But he had basically worldwide authority on the way things were done. So this is the location of the shul. The inside of the shul, which again is only, I think, 30 years old, is beautifully done. It looks like it's paved in gold on the inside as the image is loading. But if you look carefully, every inch of the surface is Hebrew letters. Every single inch is Hebrew letters. And there's on the top there, you can see it actually says Kaddish. So the Kaddish is on there. And there's different parts where there's actual psukim there, Vayibin Soharon and this and that. And the idea is that the Jewish community, every Jew is considered to be a letter in the Sefer Torah, right? So there's this idea of trying to rekindle the light of what used to be the Torah center with all of the Jews who, even though they were killed, but uses the idea of the letters as their light, as Ma'or HaGola, as a place where scholarship comes from, Torah comes from, and so on. So this is made after the Holocaust, of course, and that's part of the idea. The chairs as well are the shape of the letter Lamed. There's a whole architecture around this building. But our time is short, and I'd like to take us to our final Kina, which is a Kina which has to do with the Spanish expulsion. Esh tukad bekirbi. Now, I'm actually not going to go to Spain and Portugal. I'm actually going to go somewhere else, as I promised, and bear with me. This took a little longer than it was very ambitious, but within hopefully 10 minutes, we should be done. And then if there's some questions or comments, I'll enable you to unmute yourselves and ask questions. You can always use the chat. Esh tukad bekirbi is a kina which is written by Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra. It isn't referring specifically to the Spanish expulsion, but it's considered to be the height of the piyut, of the liturgy of the Golden Ages in Spain. And the tradition that we have the story written down in several places, that the rabbis of the time during the Spanish Inquisition, we're talking about Tisha B'Av itself, 1492, they told everybody that they have to play music as they are being deported to who knows where. From the height of the culture and security, even though, I mean, it wasn't actually smooth. There was a lot of problems in the previous 200-300 years, but they felt secure and connected to Spain and Portugal, and now they're being banished from their country. And the idea of singing is that, number one, to lift their spirits so they won't be crushed, but to play music on Tisha B'Av, imagine. But number two, it's also that they understand that the only time you mourn being kicked out of your home is when it's Yerushalayim, not the Galut. And that's the idea of the song. So I'd like to take us to a place. We were there last night in Herodian, which is a 25-minute drive from our home, where we live in Gush Etzion. And that's where we read Eikha, and where I had some insights that I want to share with you that have to do more with archaeology than the location. So Herodian is a hilltop, an artificial hilltop designed by King Herod to build his tomb in. It was made also for hospitality. There was a little theater there, which he ended up covering up later. And it has a very commanding view. You can see all the way to Yericho, to Mitzada. So there's like a network of hilltops and fortresses which he made, right? So this is Herodian. And there's a minhag that sprouted, I think in the 90s, to read Eikha there. Now, Herodian itself, I'm going to take you to a picture. I actually took this picture last night. Herodian was a stronghold of the rebellion, the Great Revolt, as well as a stronghold during the Bar Kokhba revolt. So the Romans attacked it with ballistic stones and weapons and destroyed it, because just like in Masada, this was destroyed actually a year after the temple. Masada was 4 years later. And here we are reading Eikha right next to the bathhouse of King Herod, and a bunch of soldiers sitting down. And it just was a really moving moment for me, looking at the IDF reading Eikha in this place with all of the layers of history and what this means. I mean, where we are today, where we have an army, and we're still reading Eikha, and there's still so many different issues. So I wanted to bring a few highlights that have to do with this kina. So the kina begins, Esh tukad bekorbi beha'alotia libi b'tzeiti miYerushalayim. So I have this fire within me as I think about the time when I left Egypt. Everything was great when I left Egypt, and we contrast that with Kini ma'ira leman azkira, with lamentations to remember the tragedies, b'tzeiti miYerushalayim. And the whole kina, there are several versions of it. It contrasts what things were like when I left Egypt to what things were like when I was kicked out of Yerushalayim. And that's the basic idea. Okay. By the way, to the question about I see Gita asked the question about Spanish Inquisition. The reason I'm mentioning this here, as I mentioned, this isn't referring specifically to the Spanish Inquisition. Rather, it's the height of the Spanish Golden Age poetry, and I'm using it to talk about the expulsion, specifically because of that story of singing when you leave Spain, when you're kicked out of there, to really only mourning when you're kicked out of Yerushalayim. That's why I'm using it in that context to talk about that. That's the only connection. It comes from Spain. And that's the basic idea. So now let's get into the details. So I'm just a few highlights, okay? Just a few highlights of these contrasts. So the first one is as follows: Kaporet ve'aron ve'avnei zikaron. Some have, I've heard several different tunes for it. The tune I'm used to is Kaporet ve'aron ve'avnei zikaron betzeti mimitzrayim ve'avnei akela uchlei habala betzeti mirushalayim. So Kaporet ve'aron, that we have the Aron Habrit, the picture of it, Avnei Zikaron, the stones that Aaron HaKohen wears. That's the glory of leaving Egypt. Those were the stones we had and the tools we had, the tools of war. You can say that the Aron, we say Kuma Hashem ve'afutzu oivecha. When we open the Aron Kodesh, we talk about the Aron as like in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's like a weapon that laser beams our way and clears a path, right? And contrasting that, ve'avnei hakela uchlei habala, ballistic stones and tools of war, weapons of war and destruction. And these stones are, I took this picture in the Masada Museum, which was ballistic stones from the Romans, which took down the rebellions in Masada. I took the same picture in Herodian last night. This is what we're talking about. In Klei HaBela, I'm going to, one last trip to a museum, the rest is going to be images. In the Israel Museum, in the Roman gallery, we have Roman armor and weaponry, which was used in the context of the battles against the Jews in the Great Revolt. So we have, this is in the Israel Museum again, we have arrows, helmets, and a whole chain of mail, which is of course rusty, and swords, and all kinds of other instruments which have to do with the Roman Empire. We also have a milestone of Vespasian over here, and this is a bust of Hadrian, which we'll talk about in a moment. We're looking at him from the back. So this is the Roman destruction. This is, if you were on my recent tour, Failed Revolutions and Pathways to Hope, we were in here. I'm doing one more this week on Tuesday, but that's it for the summer. So this is the last part of the museum we're going to look at, but that's the contrast. The next contrast I want to talk about is Moshe Yir'enu ve'Aharon Yanchenu. We were led, we were shepherded by Moshe and Aharon, okay? Moshe and Aharon. Now, but in contrast to that, Moshe Yar'enu ve'Aharon Yanchenu b'tzetim miMitzrayim, Nebuchadnezzar ve'Adrianus Caesar. There's another version, Adrianus Hatzar. There's also Titus Hatzar, b'tzetim Yerushalayim. So Nebuchadnezzar is first temple. Adrianus Caesar is already the suppression of Beitar, the Bar Kokhba revolt, which is, we do have Kinot about the Bar Kokhba revolt. In the Israel Museum, there's a whole section there about the fall of Beitar and a special triumphal arch, which Hadrian built, to answer the question in the chat. And the next part I want to read is not that contrast, but Pe'erei Mikbaot Lechavod Nikbaot. We have this beautiful processions with Mikbaat that the Kohanim would wear, which were Lechavod Uletif'aret, which in a procession, everybody sees the Kohanim in their glory. And we're contrasting that with Shrikot Utruot Lekalon Uzvaot, whistling and howling at us at our downfall, when we were being paraded in humiliation, to the spitting and boos and shouting of our enemies. And I'm bringing two examples for that. Number one is the destruction of Beit Rishon. This is the Ishtar Gate of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon, where when we were paraded on our way in from the destruction. This is currently reconstructed. You can see it in Berlin. Saddam Hussein made a copy of it. So that is the Shrikot Utroot Lekalon Uzvaot, the humiliating processions from the first temple period. And then we have from the second temple period. So this is the Ishtar Gate. I want you to get an idea of these processions. And we're going to skip. Time is short. And now we have the famous procession which happened in Rome, which is commemorated on the Arch of Titus. So the Arch of Titus, we can also see the kelim of the Mikdash. We see if we're used to looking just at the menorah because it became iconic, but look at the right, and you'll see that there's two trumpets. There's the Chatzotzrot, as well as a shulchan, maybe with levona, maybe with the incense, but they're paraded by soldiers in a triumphal arch, which is made to commemorate our defeat, right? This is in Rome, and I linked the bibliography below on the bottom right, so you realize where the colors came from. There was a study with the Yeshiva University where they actually discovered the yellow of the menorah after a basically an educated guess that it would be there, because we know that the statues in the Roman world were colorful. If you actually are in New York now, you should go to the Met, and in the Greco-Roman gallery, there's a special exhibition called polychromy, which is a variation of gods in color from Germany. It's basically a study of what the Roman statues looked like in full color, which we always assumed they were white because the color faded, it was scraped off over thousands of years, but they were colorful. So this fits into that general context of Roman color. But this is the procession, okay? Our last part, and I'm going to connect this also to Bar Kokhba, it's a bit associative, is as follows. Shulchan u'menorah v'chalil u'ktorah. We have the shulchan, the showbread table, the menorah, and kalil u'ktorah, we have the incense, betzetim mitzrayim. By contrasting that, elil v'to'eva u'pesel u'matzeva, we have all kinds of idolatry and statues and shrines when we leave Yerushalayim. Now, I'm showing you a coin that has images that we usually don't pay attention to. On the left, I have Shulchan u'menorah kalil u'ktorah. This is a Roman-style incense shovel from the Bar Kokhba caves. And on the right is the coin, which is the basis for the 10 agorot coin, which you all know from Israel. It's a coin from Matityahu Antigonos, the last Hashmonaite king, who almost killed King Herod. Herod ran away to Herodian, actually. That's where his life was saved. That's probably why he wanted to be buried there. And he ended up coming back and destroying him. But this was the last stand of the last of the Maccabees, of the Hashmonaim. He made a special coin when under siege, fighting against Herod, trying to rally the people's support to support him, the Kohen Gadol, from the family of the Kohanim, when the temple service is still in operation by Kohanim. And his way of motivating people is on the money. This is a suggestion by Yaakov Mishorer, the curator at the Israel Museum, the late curator. On one side is the menorah. Everyone's familiar with that, but nobody looks at the other side of the coin, which is probably the shulchan, not designed too well, but the shulchan. The shulchan u'menorah, which both represent the service of the Kohanim in the temple and a way to say, support me, and you have a chance of this thing still being. Support Herod, and it's all over, as indeed it pretty much was after that. So the last part I want to show you is also coins, but has to do with elil v'to'eva or pesel matzeva. These are I'm going to show you Bar Kokhba coins. So in the Bar Kokhba coins, we have on the top is just a random Roman coin. And the point was, we also have Ilia Capitolina coins like this. The point is, the Roman coins would have a temple, and on the temple, they would have, on top, inside it would be some sort of deity. Pesel matzeva, right? Either it's Tyche or Athena or Jupiter, or whatever it is. There were such coins of Ilia Capitolina, Jerusalem as well. When Bar Kokhba revolted, he made these special coins, which have a very similar temple, but instead of having a pesel matzeva, having a statue in the center, he had some sort of kli, some holy vessel from the temple. We don't know which. There is an argument of, is it the shulchan, is it the aron, but it's not, we don't have 100% clarity because the aron didn't exist at the time of the Second Temple, and how did they picture it anyway? So it's a discussion. And on the other side, we have the Arba Minim, which is also a very important, ends up becoming an icon. Now, I'm wrapping up here. Thank you for your patience. We went a little bit over time. I hope this was helpful and meaningful. I want to show you how the closing verse of this Kinot has to do with building, and I'm going to show you some archaeology which has to do with the Byzantine period, late Second Temple period, late Roman period through the Byzantine period, which shows you artifacts which have iconic images which meant Jewish and connect us to the temple. And whether it's the Bar Kokhba coin, which meant something different at the time, to a mosaic, which has in the center a menorah, on the left lulav and etrog, on the right it has a shofar and a machta, which, by the way, this image took a long time for archaeologists to identify what we're actually looking at because we've been detached from it. And that is, of course, an incense shovel, which has to do with the service in the Beit HaMikdash. On the right is a bread stamp, which similar images, shofar, lulav, menorah, from the Byzantine period. These are in the Israel Museum. And finally, just to get an idea, this is really just a glimpse of, there's a whole, I mean, I did a whole piece, a final project on synagogues. This is just one slide, but it shows you how these four images, the menorah, the shulchan, the machta, and the arba minim, show up in synagogues all over the country for the next few hundred years, especially the famous one in the center, Shalom al Israel, which is in the Good Samaritan Museum. It was found in Yericho. So this basically shows you how when we were banished from Yerushalayim and the temple, we still maintained ways of maintaining, remembering how to stay in touch with all of these things throughout history. So in hope for a rebuilding. So when Mashiach comes, we'll actually know what's going on, right? What's flying, what these things are, what we want to actually rebuild. So I'm ending with the verses of the Kinot. There's two versions. The Ashkenazi version says as follows: Torah u'teuda u'kli hachemda. We have Torah, etc., and klei hachemda, the vessels of the temple, will have them back. That's the images that we saw. Sason v'simcha v'nas yagon v'anacha b'shuvi liYerushalayim, and all this happiness and joy and no more misery and wailing when I come back to Jerusalem. And the version, which is probably closest to the original, because this is a Sephardic poem, it's a slightly different version. It has three lines at the end. I'll let it load. And it says as follows: Kel Elokei tzvakot yar'enu niflaot. Well, the God of hosts shall show us things, ketzeitim mitzrayim, just like when we left Mitzrayim. V'yashiv shchinato el Tzion v'avodato el toch Yerushalayim, and shall return his shchina, his divine presence, to Tzion, to Zion, and its service into Yerushalayim. That was it. Thank you very much for your time. I hope this was something helpful. I will now, first of all, I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm going to upload this to YouTube later.